Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Barbara Peters at the Poison Pen, and it's our pleasure to welcome Joey Hartstone, a debut author, our favorite thing. Anyway, Joey, it's so nice to meet you.
Thank you for having me. Nice
and here is his lovely book called The Local, which is it's an interesting title. It's very short. What did you sense that it was supposed to convey to the uninitiated reader?
Well, it's actually sort of the job title of the main character, who's a local counsel in the Eastern District of Texas. But there's also just a theme in this small Texas town of kind of insiders and outsiders and locals and people who are not from there. So I think it captured it, and I was happy that they didn't make me change it.
Oh, it was your title.
It was, yeah, but I was trying not to hold on to it for dear life because I thought they might make me change it, but they never did. So.
That is interesting because authors almost never get to do their own titles, and they have nothing to do with the cover or design of the book. The publisher actually owns the rights to the type layout and the artwork and all the rest of the author has a copyright to the to the story, but the publisher has the copyright to the rest of it. So it's kind of an interesting distinction. Anyway, Joey has signed some of them in the back room. This is our first mystery club book of June. And when I read it, I was immediately captured by the voice, but also Joey wanted to be a lawyer, as I understand
Yes,
it,
very much.
but got sidelined.
I did.
And I actually did read the law, and then I got sidelined by becoming the plaintiff in a medical malpractice case, and now I'm a bookseller because I won the case. Lots of money. And so the Poison Pen is actually a not-for-profit bookstore as a consequence of all that. But anyway, many of the things that your guy went through, I've been through.
Okay.
So why don't you tell us about who he is and what he's been doing before we get to the predicament that he finds himself in?
Sure. So the main character's name is James Euchre, and he lives in Marshall, Texas. And this is a real town where about 20 years ago a new federal judge was appointed, and he changed the rules of his courtroom to sort of entice patent infringement cases to be filed here. And so slowly but surely they started to file more and more, and what they found were the juries here were very plaintiff friendly and they liked awarding massive damages. So all of a sudden their docket just got flooded with all of these out of town and out of state patent infringement lawsuits. And so all these big teams of lawyers from big cities would come in, but they needed a local counsel to sort of sit on their team with them, but they didn't often do very much. But as locals started to do a little bit more, they realized that they were invaluable to communicating to the local juries. So there's just this cottage industry of like great trial lawyers in East Texas who most of them did not want to be patent lawyers. They'd never really studied that in law school, but they just found their niche as like as doing great openings and closings and communicating with juries. So when I found out about this town and this particular profession, I thought that it would make a great character.
So one of the things about patent cases is usually they're complicated. You know, the whole thing is difficult to explain to the average person, and therefore, if you have a somewhat unsophisticated jury, you never even know. I mean, jury trials can go any way. If any of you watched the Lincoln Lawyer, the new Michael Connelly, if you didn't watch it, I highly recommend it. Even though the movie by Matthew McConaughey was great, it's totally different. And I think the guy they've cast is wonderful. But really, in court, and I can say this from having argued a lot of cases, it's the best story wins. It always wins, regardless of, we think it's all about forensic evidence nowadays and the whole bit, and that influences the jury. But if you look at the O.J. Simpson case, there's a classic, that jury was determined because it was too close to the Rodney King incident. That jury was absolutely determined to effect, a not guilty verdict for O.J. Simpson. Marcia Clark and I have talked about that. And once they didn't allow the venue to change to a not L.A. Jury, it was, basically all over. And picking the jury, there's a new book out by Robin Figueroa. You might not have read it, but you might have seen it. It's another legal thriller called With Prejudice. And basically what he's saying is that once you pick the jury, you basically determine the outcome of the trial. And that's kind of what you're talking about here, isn't it?
Yeah, if you don't have one of these guys on your team, you're going to have a real difficult time convincing the 8 members of the juries to
well, right, but you have a jury that is not, they're not Harvard grads.
No.
So if you're doing a patent case where they're probably going to be lost anyhow,
Yes.
it's an ideal situation for a plaintiff, right?
Well, and as you said, I mean, there can be cases about like microbiology and engineering and things that you couldn't possibly understand unless you had a degree in one of those fields, whether or not company A infringed on a patent that company B held. So, yeah, like you said, it just comes down to how you communicate to those people.
So, Mr. Euchre, tell us about his life, because he's just sort of walking through it.
Yeah, so he sort of starts out and you think he's a bit of just sort of a cavalier, somewhat superficial guy, and I think that sort of fit with what his job description is, but the more you go through the book, the more you find that that's kind of a facade that he's putting on because he's suffered some pain and some loss in his past, and he's trying to just keep it under the surface and try to protect himself from ever getting hurt again. But as he gets further and further into this case, he is sort of forced to confront some of his past demons and deal with it.
And the reason is?
The reason that he's there as a patent lawyer and, you know, interpreting to local juries. But what happens to him is his mentor gets murdered. And so he has a corporate client who gets charged with the crime, and he has already pitched himself to this client as the interpreter this client needs in order to win his patent case. And so now that his client is going to stand trial for murder in this town, he wants him because he's already convinced him that he's the best person to communicate to the local juries, even though James doesn't actually want to be the representative in this case, and he's not a criminal defense attorney, but he's convinced his client otherwise. So he goes into the world of criminal defense for the first time.
You know, I posted a picture of the local on Instagram because that's the one social media thing that I do for the bookstore. And I said that, you know, he's a patent attorney forced to become, you know, a criminal law attorney and defend somebody. And one of the comments was, "This book is a fantasy."
I saw that. Yeah.
Right. Which to some degree is true. It is. It's not an easy transition from something as largely arcane, really, as patent law to criminal defense work. But in this particular situation, it does make sense. If you were in a more sophisticated environment, I didn't think that it could happen.
Yeah, I saw that comment. Those are the types of comments that I definitely read and think about as I fall asleep at night. But I mean, often I feel like with fiction, you push the boundaries a bit because that's why you tell a story about that and not your average run-of-the-mill local counsel who's just trying a patent case. In fact, I tried to think of how can I make intellectual property law interesting enough to write a book about it. And it was just too difficult.
Hard.
Yeah.
Pretty hard. Well, actually, I didn't think that the guy's comment was pejorative. I didn't think it was negative. I thought he was actually being funny.
Oh.
You know, was the way I took it. But just
true.
to show you how weird it is, patent law and trademark law are basically very similar. So back in 1989, when I wanted to, when I opened the store, being a lawyer, I thought, you know, I need to trademark the name. So I didn't think it was going to be that hard. I mean, people say, you know, why is it called the poisoned pen, not poison? And here's the reason. When our patent and trademark attorney, very, very nice guy, an author actually in St. Louis, went to research the names, which you have to do, there was an existing company called the Poison Pen. And I won't tell you about the scurrilous nature of this company. It was not one that you want to be associated with, and you really didn't want to go to their website. But the point is that because the Poison Pen existed, they wouldn't let us trademark the Poison Pen. And they didn't really, if we wanted to be the Poisoned Pen, we had to get permission from this woman who owned this other on the website. So our attorney, he tried, and she absolutely refused to sign up. So there we were, and we already had our logo, and you know, it was all exciting, and here we were stumbling block. So I thought, okay, you know, I'm good at this. So I called her, and we talked a little bit, and I said to her, do you know what kind of business we are? And she said no, and I said, well, we're a bookstore, and one of the things we're going to do is we're going to invite authors to come and speak to us and so forth. Oh, she said. And I said, what would it take for you to sign off on this trademark application? She said, well, my favorite lawyer is I mean, sorry, my favorite author is, I can't remember who it was actually, but it was, and I said, well, here's the deal. I said, if I can promise you a signed copy of every book that this author writes for the next 10 years, is that going to be good enough? And she said, absolutely. So she signed off on it, and, you know, we got to be, but that's why, and it throws people because the ED, you know, is tricky, but that's the reason it's called, well, you know, poison pen letters were the Twitter of their day. That was how gossip circulated around. If you read any Agatha Christie book, you will find that poison pen letters are kind of an engine of them, because that's how people did a Twitter mob. They trolled people, you know, with, well, that's what you had to do, you know. So you could detect them by, you know, difficulties with the keyboard. You know, if somebody had, so Dorothy Sayers' book, one of them turns on the fact that like the O in the typewriter was, you know, destroyed. So technology keeps changing, and we have to do that in mysteries. But even though that was a dramatic story for us, I can't think of any way you could build a book around anything like that. So it did need to move to a
I tried
murder
for
trial.
a while, but the moment you kill somebody, it just becomes so much more interesting. So.
Right. So you have to transform your guy's life and make him up to the task.
Yeah.
Right. So how did you go about, you know, how did you think about taking a guy who's basically floating, hoping that nothing will hurt him, and turn him into somebody who could actually try a criminal case? Because he has to be kind of a shark to do it.
He does. So, I mean, so one is that he's really good in a courtroom. He's really good with juries. And then the other thing was his backstory is that his father was a great trial lawyer in Texas, and that's probably, and a criminal defense attorney at that. And so that's one of the reasons why he always stayed away from that area of law, because he just knew he'd never measure up to him. So secretly, I think it's something that he always wanted to do and to see how well he could do.
But he was afraid he wasn't good enough?
Yeah, I think so. I think he was afraid. I think he even knew that he would probably never live up to it, even if he was really good, because his father was sort of legendary in the state. And I think he was just afraid of being compared to him.
Right. So, I mean, this is a really great Father's Day book, which is why I suggested it. But, you know, part of it, I think, is how difficult it is for a child to live up to a parent who is larger than the ordinary parent in life, so to speak. I mean, it would be true of women and mothers just as much as fathers and sons, although maybe it's more a male thing. Maybe women aren't quite so driven to do this. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a question. You're all women. What do you think? Was it hard to live up to your mother?
I think it's more of a male thing, like you said.
Maybe now that more women, though, are having careers and being powerful, it may actually change, because I don't think it's gender so much as power.
Yeah, I don't know. I find it is weird. I don't measure myself up against my dad, actually. I mean, there are parts of my relationship with my father that are in this book, but not that aspect. And I agree. I think it is more of a male trait, but it's not. I don't think it's a healthy way to judge your own value in any way, is to measure yourself against anyone, and especially someone like your parent, who you'll never in your own mind measure up to, because they just loom large. So.
And his dad is dead, right?
Yes.
So it would be different if he were alive.
Yeah.
Why did you make that decision? Because it could have gone either way.
To have his dad dead?
Yeah.
I think part of, my father died about 14 years ago, so that was part of it. So I liked having him confront things. I'd never written about that loss before, and since this was usually I write screenplays and for TV and stuff, and so this was more personal. So I wanted to get into some aspects of my life that I hadn't really gotten the chance to write about. So loss of a parent, sort of love life, that kind of thing.
Wow. You know, I've always felt that every novel has some piece of the author in it. But in your case, that's really brave of you to say that, too, because most of the time authors pretend like it's not really me in here. There's no autobiography involved in this story, which is so not true.
Yeah.
I used to write like that, and I feel like when I actually tried to write away from myself, it wasn't as good. And then when I tried to write myself but not tell anybody about it, it felt, I think people can see through it anyway, so you might as well just cop to it. I mean, it's not all me, so you can guess which parts are and which parts aren't. But
people that know you would know that.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yeah.
So you know, people often for a first novel drift towards crime because there's a structure that comes with a crime novel, and if you're a new author and you're not, you know, you haven't figured out how to tell your story or structure your story, it's kind of readily available. And but in your case, it sounds like the reason. Well, why is it that you decided to? You've kind of told us, but.
Well, I love the law, and so I have a lot of my family members and friends are lawyers, and so I have one friend who's an intellectual property lawyer, and he was telling me about this town, and that's why I got really interested in it. But that was the only other profession I really wanted, other than to be a writer, was to be a lawyer. So it's even though there is sort of a bit of a murder mystery in this book, that was less appealing to me than the actual courtroom scenes, which may not tend to be as riveting as searching for a killer, but the movies I love, the books I love, are always about lawyers, and I like the ones where they're actually in a courtroom and they're getting to lawyer and not just detective work. So
you wrote them really well, and you've had a lot of positive response to the courtroom scenes. There are a number of authors who are not lawyers who write legal mysteries. John LeSquire, for example, would be, and he has a lifelong friend who's a very hotshot attorney that helps him with all of that. Did you have somebody you could rely on to?
I did, yeah, a few, but mainly my Aunt Kathy, who is, she was a public defender in California for 30 years, and so she handled almost exclusively capital punishment cases, murder cases. So she had a lot of experience in the courtroom and a lot of experience with murder trials, and she read several drafts of this and would walk me through the courtroom scenes and try to make it so it was believable.
So in a small town, the one that you have described in the book, would there actually be a public defender?
So I think there would be. But this client is very wealthy, so I don't think he would get to use a public defender. And I think that is one of the fantasy aspects to this, is he could hire a very expensive legal team, but it's sort of built into the conceit of this story that an expensive legal team from California or New York isn't going to be the people that you want representing you in this town that doesn't really like outsiders. So
right, the jury, in other words, would be turned off if this really high power. That's such a, that really is true. I mean, I thought you run across that in British mysteries, possibly more than in American. But it is definitely the case. Well, we've seen it with the whole Trump thing going on. That I know, but nonetheless,
It's true, though.
people, right. Don't want more sophisticated or better educated or what they think are rich people or whatever it is telling them what to do or intruding on it. It's been a very populist movement here in the States, and so I find it very believable that that was a reason. But you haven't talked about who the client is, because there are other considerations because of his background.
Yeah, so because of the insider-outsider aspect, I wanted to have the client be as big of an outsider as possible. So he's a Pakistani American whose father immigrated here from Pakistan, was a cab driver in New York, and so he grew up in New York City, and then he moved to Silicon Valley, and he started his own company, which is basically like an Uber or Lyft, but it only uses taxi cabs, because his father essentially was run out of business by Uber and Lyft. And so what he wants is the gig economy to sort of work for the people that it usually displaces, and that's kind of the story that he's built his company on. And it may or may not be true, but it seems to be a story that he's marketing himself with. And so he's he sort of makes the objections that a lot of corporations have about being sued here, which is, I don't build anything here, my company's not based here, the company that's suing me isn't based in this state, why am I getting sued here? If for no other reason than it's just plaintiff friendly and you're more likely to prevail. So the response to him has been not exactly what I anticipated, because he's angry, but in my opinion, he's justifiably angry. And he also is going to be charged with murder, and you're not going to know for the bulk of the book whether or not he actually did it. So you have to at least be convinced that this person might be capable of it. But everything he says, I think there's real truth behind it. And so, he's angry, but at least as he's saying it, he's been falsely accused of murder in a small town, and he's feeling, as someone who's an outsider, both geographically and racially and everything else, he's not happy to be here. So I don't see him as unjustifiably angry, I guess I'll say.
No, I didn't think so either, but I think you tinged on racism. I think that as a person of color in East Texas, that you'd have to actually worry about that. So I think that might be one of the reasons that he was willing to stick with Joey, is that he didn't know whether the incoming counsel would would be influenced or would be to some degree racist or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
So, I thought that made him an interesting client. I mean, he could have been, just some guy from like Poland or something
Right.
instead, and then, you wouldn't have had the whole person of color thing coming into the story.
Yeah, I mean, so the town is about half white and half black, and it was a very big locale for the South during the for the Confederacy. So, sort of racism, slavery, all that stuff is really baked into this town, and even there's like a chapter in here where he's giving a tour to his co-counsel who's from out of state, and he's showing her like, here's the Paramount Theater and here's the side door where no one ever told me as a kid, but that's where the black patrons had to go, and they sat up top when my mother was a child. And so there's all these elements to the past of this town that sort of imbue everything about it, even when they don't talk about it.
So now that you've written this really interesting story, and if we've made it sound too technical, we shouldn't. I mean, actually, it is a legal thriller being the operative word here. So we're just doing background, but the story really pulls you right along and right through it. But now that you've got this little town, are you thinking of giving him another case?
Yeah.
If so, is he going to stay in East Texas?
I would love to, yeah. I mean, I think Texas is just a great place, especially for criminal law, because they have very interesting laws there.
They do have some interesting laws there.
Yeah. So, and I like I like characters from there. So yeah, I would love to continue this and continue to have this lawyer forge his way further and further into criminal law.
But can you plausibly have him defending, criminals in this case, in this little town? Are there going to be enough criminals?
I've got 2 more in mind, so I'm hopeful I can at least have 3 books out of it, and then maybe he'll have to branch out and go to Dallas. But.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can't get to Cabot's Cove, if you have a small place and, everybody dies, then you kind of wipe out the town. If he's going to shift away from patent law to criminal law, then he would shift location. Eventually, he'd almost have
yes,
to.
at some point, if he actually makes that choice instead of just getting pulled into cases begrudgingly, then I think he would probably have to move.
I asked this question in part because you always want to know if there's going to be a follow-up.
Yeah.
Some books are written not to have a sequel, but this one I felt did want a sequel.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the Lincoln Lawyer, so like I said, I'm a screenwriter, so I was up for a job on that TV show and did not get it, but I read all of the series because of that.
Right.
And that's what made me want to write this, because I was originally conceiving this as a TV show. And what happens, at least in my experience where I am in my career, is I pitch a show around town. If I'm lucky, I get hired to write the pilot, and then it usually doesn't get picked up. But in doing that, you kind of create at least the whole first season in your mind, and it's sort of unfulfilling to not get to write it. So after I read The Lincoln Lawyer, I thought, that's the kind of story I want this to be. And if I write the book, even if nobody ever sees it and I just pitch it as a TV series, at least I'll have that fulfilling conclusion that I wrote the whole story and I know what it is. And if I do get to make it as a TV show, at least in my mind, I'll have told the whole story. So.
But writing a book is different than writing television. We've had a lot of people here who have come to us from a screenwriting background, and most of them find that writing a novel is a lot more enjoyable. For one thing, you get to do it all by yourself, as opposed to doing it by, in a writer's room or committee, whatever. Nobody gets to say, no, that's the wrong ending, or let's kill that guy, or whatever. So you're in control of it. And Mike has gone the other way. Michael Connelly has gone from being a novelist to heavily into. I don't know if he actually writes the shows. The books are the basis for them.
He's in the writer's room on The
lot?
Lincoln Lawyer. I don't know about Bosch, but he is for The Lincoln Lawyer.
Well, they must be. And in fact, Bosch, the other show, for those of you who haven't read Michael or know about it, he's combined some of the books in the scripts for the show. So it isn't like The Lincoln Lawyer. Is he doing that, or is that basically just the one novel?
No, so I think there's 6 or 7. So they started the TV show with the second book.
Right, but it's just that book.
It's just a second, and they picked it up for a second season, which will be based on the third book.
Which is exciting.
Yeah.
So Bosch is different, though, because Bosch has got pieces of various books together and it's branched off. But one of the things that's so neat about the TV version of it, because it's more obvious, is that the answer to it is in plain sight almost all the way through it. And, you feel at the end, you go, oh, I really should have seen that. But there's I mean, seriously, and I don't know that you can achieve that same thing in a book. I think it's more a visual thing, you know, that
Yeah.
works in the TV version
Yeah.
more dramatically than it would
Yeah.
work in the book.
Well, that feeling that you described of like kicking yourself when you get to the end, I think that's what I find to be like the most fulfilling conclusions. I think if you get to the end and you had no shot at getting it right, you kind of feel cheated.
Yes.
So I think there has to be just enough that you feel like if I had looked just a little closer and thought a little harder before I got to that last page, I might have been able to guess it.
You know, that was the thing about, remember Postmortem, Patricia Cornwell's first book, which was a huge hit and a huge bestseller. And, you know, the baggage handler didn't show up until like page 289. And I always wondered, you know, why? Because there was no fair play available in that book. There just wasn't, you know. And I think it was because it was the whole Morgan autopsy, you know, people were interested in the profession and all of that, but and didn't pay that much attention to the plot. But it was not a fair play.
Yeah. Yeah, it's. I mean, I watched because I was thinking of it as a TV show. I watched a lot of British TV shows, like Broadchurch, which was one of my favorites. But it was one where there's a new suspect every single episode, and then you get to the end, and it was the first time I guessed who it was. And I guessed because there was absolutely no reason that should be the killer. There was nothing baked in.
You know, that is so true in a lot of the TV shows. We've watched a lot of French ones, which are absolutely fabulous on MHC TV. And at some point, I can usually turn to my husband and say, "That's the one." He goes, "Why?" And I said, "Because there's no reason for this person to, you know, have been in the book and in the show and then reappear. If they're just there once, it's okay. But if they, you know, if the maid is back, you know, it's the maid.
Yeah,
it really is." Did you watch Line of Duty?
Yes, is that the? Yeah,
That's
I think
the
that's British.
British.
Yeah, I did.
And that one is depressing because what it reveals to you is that, excuse me, there's always corruption in the police department. I mean, no matter how you do it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So, did you want to read a page or so just so we can sort of get your voice?
Yeah. I think I can skip to so.
I saw you had it marked, so I thought.
Well,
you might want to do that.
I can often read the first, but we kind of covered a little bit of the setup. But so it opens with James, and he's at the end of his final case for the year, and he's about to deliver his closing argument. So.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention it is Christmas.
Yes, it is Christmas.
Which is another factor here.
Yeah. So I'll just read that closing argument. I think it sets up a lot. So he says, "Thank you, Your Honor. I rose to my feet but didn't button my jacket. I walked toward the 8 members of the jury in complete silence. It was the first time they would be hearing from me since they were selected, and I wanted to give them a few more beats. I found my mark and then hesitated, as if unsure of how to begin. Truthfully, I knew every word that was about to come out of my mouth. I was going to deliver my patented Ford pickup closing. As a matter of legal fact, a collection of words, such as the speech, cannot be patented but rather copyrighted, so suffice it to say it was my favorite summation. When I was 15 years old, the widow who lived next door to me decided to sell her late husband's truck. It was a 1964 Ford F-100 with a cracked windshield, missing fender, and dented grille. Its original Rangoon red paint job was perfectly matched the high school's colors, was peeling, and had faded under the sun. It was the most beautiful vehicle I'd ever seen. I struck a deal with the widow. In 1 year, I would buy that truck for $2,400. Bagging groceries at the Kroger for $3.35 an hour wasn't going to cut it, so I got a paper route and started mowing lawns on the weekends. I took any odd job I could find, and for 1 year I didn't spend a penny unless I absolutely had to. Where most boys would keep a picture of their girlfriends in their wallet, I had a photo of this old truck, a reminder of what all the hard work was for. And the best day of my young life was when I emptied out my savings account, handed my neighbor all $2,400 to my name, and became the proud owner of a Ford pickup. When I got behind the wheel, a feeling of achievement washed over me. I'd never felt that way before. 2 weeks later, I stepped outside my home with the keys in my hand and discovered that the driveway was empty. I paused here as if overcome by the memory. I'm embarrassed to admit how many minutes passed before I accepted the reality. I'd never owned anything, and now my one possession in the world had been stolen. For weeks, I kept my eyes peeled, hoping I'd find my Ford abandoned somewhere, just waiting for me to rescue it. Then one day I got a call from Detective Elliott. He says they think they may have found it up in Marion County, but before they go and accuse someone of grand theft auto, they want me to confirm that it's mine. So we go up to Marion, and we pull up to this ratty old house with weeds for a yard, and there, parked right in front for all the world to see, is a 1964 F-100 with a cracked windshield, missing fender, and dented grille. I jump out of the cruiser and run up the driveway. Just then, a man in his 20s comes out of the house and hollers at me to get off his porch. I move right to him, fish my wallet out of my pocket, hold the photo of the Ford up in his face like it's a police badge, and declare, "My name is James Euchre, and that is my truck." The man looks at the photo and then back at me and says, "That can't be your truck. Your truck is red. That truck right there is black." I paused again, allowing the audacity of this comment to infect my listeners. Not only had this man taken my vehicle, but now caught dead to rights with my property in his possession, he had the nerve to deny everything after he had stolen my beloved truck because he had covered that original Rangoon red body with a cheap coat of black paint. For all the flaws in our legal system, the one thing that we got right was entrusting ordinary people to dispense justice. Even in a field as complicated as intellectual property law, we put our faith in common citizens. Patents can be incredibly complex. It often takes an advanced degree in electrical engineering or microbiology to understand how something works, let alone whether or not the idea behind it was taken from someone else's design. The lawyers from the firms on both sides of this case had spent the past 5 days asking these jurors to think. In my first 5 minutes, I had asked them to feel.
Very nice. Right. Does he go on and scratch the black paint to reveal the red underneath it?
No, but it's definitely his truck.
It is his truck.
It is his
and
truck.
now you know why there
Yes.
is a truck, in fact, because I thought, you need to
Yes.
hear that speech in order to discover it. Well, we probably can't say very much more about the book because we don't want to spoil it for you. Do any of you have questions that you'd like to ask?
Yes.
Was it hard for you to write about a real town and not feel like the people there would be upset about it or upset about what you said?
Yeah, I mean, that was a little weird. So I've written 2 movies and they're both about real people. One was about Lyndon Johnson. So the nice thing was he was already dead, so he wasn't going to be mad at what I wrote. But so I have thought a lot about it, and I think you can't think too much about how the subjects are going to respond. But in this case, I thought if they absolutely hate it, I just won't go back to Marshall. But I thought a lot about Friday Night Lights.
Stoned in Marshall, Texas.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
That could be a title of your next book.
It
right?
could. But yeah, there's a chance. But I mean, I did, in some ways I fell in love with it. I mean, like I said, I'm from Flagstaff, so it was fun to go see a little town that was not too dissimilar in size. And there are things that I really thought were interesting about it. So I hope they feel like I treated them fairly.
So the town itself is almost like a character.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's a really interesting place, and then this whole patent litigation stuff that they've got going on there. When people from outside come to look at it, it's usually people who want to write about it in a negative light, and there is some stuff that's negative about it, but that wasn't really what I wanted to do. So every time I talked to a lawyer there, I had to spend like half an hour just convincing them that that was not my angle, at least not for this first installment. And that was nice because what they do, they're very proud of what they do, and I wanted to create a character who was passionate about his work and not criticize everything from an outsider's point of view.
Pat, are there any questions that you want to address?
So we have a question from the audience online. Has writing always been a passion?
Yeah, I didn't think it was going to be a career until I graduated from college, but yeah, someone asked me the other day what the first thing was that I wrote that I remember writing, and I was in 2nd grade, and I had written a story about my mom dying because my parents had just gotten divorced, and my mom and my 2nd grade teacher were crying, and I didn't know why, but so I think I've always sort of wanted to express myself in the written word.
Is that it?
Do you have any books that you currently love that you want to share with the rest of the audience?
Most recently, I read a book called Bathhouse by P.J. Vernon, who is published by the same publisher as me, and so that's how I met him. And it's an exceptional thriller about it's a little bit of an erotic thriller, but yeah, he blurbed the back of this book, so I like to promote his book because I genuinely enjoyed it before I met him, and he's a fantastic guy, and I've sort of got to follow in his path for everything about the publishing world. So.
And we've already talked about Michael Connelly, so.
Yes.
But I like your quote from Woody Harrelson. How about that? He says, "The Local is everything I love in a book. It's a thriller, a whodunit, and a sexy courtroom drama. It's a real page-turner with fascinating characters that take place in my home state of Texas. Enjoy." Woody Harrelson, do you know him?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. So the 2 movies I wrote, he stars in both of them. So I wouldn't go so far as to say we're friends, but we know each other enough that I was able to reach out and say, "Would you mind doing me a huge favor?" And he's a very nice man, so he did.
Lovely. All right. So you did just touch upon a potential problem I think you have, which is if the judge who set this whole thing in motion, that the patent the venue, the fact this is a great place to do patent cases, and he ruled his courtroom with a really iron fist and was great, and he's the one that's murdered. So my question would be, who's going to carry the whole thing forward without him? And that you haven't dealt with it in this book, so you can deal with it in the next book.
Yeah, yeah. So the real judge is a guy named T. John Ward, and he took over, I think, in 1999, and I think he stepped down about 5 or 6 years ago. So they actually are under their second judge now, and he has taken on the reins, and he's doing the same thing. I mean, there's a Supreme Court case that came down a couple years ago that tried to limit the amount of patent cases they could take in the Eastern District, but they still have a ton, and yeah, the judge is still running it like a factory there.
But in this book,
Yeah.
you don't have an obvious successor to the dead judge.
So there's this one thing about this area. There's this particular area, like, so that building right there is the old Harrison County Courthouse, which is now actually a museum. But right next to it is the Federal District Court, which is really sort of a modest building, and you'd walk past it and you wouldn't know that this was a huge federal court in this country. So the main judge, the one who's killed, works upstairs, but then there's like this basement where the magistrate judge works, and he kind of just is the understudy, and he takes all the pretrial stuff that Judge Gardner doesn't have the bandwidth to deal with. So and that is, I think, what the actual successor in the Eastern District did. So in my mind, he's probably the guy who's going to replace him. But it's a presidential appointment, so it takes a U.S. senator to recommend them, and then a president to appoint them, so it can be anybody.
Right, but if you're going to set another book in this town, you're going to have to figure that one out.
I will. I definitely will.
That was my point. You know, you're not going to be able to ignore it. Sorry, but yeah.
Yes.
Right. So legal training is you spend much of your time thinking ahead. It's all about what if you're actually studying the law. So one of you asked me, was it you, about why books come out on Tuesdays. So I will explain it to you since we have a little time here. And it's all about a lawsuit.
Oh, really?
So back in the very early 90s, when Barnes & Noble was like the, creeping over the earth, and small bookstores, this is before Amazon, so it was when Barnes & Noble was, in every good thriller, you need a great antagonist, right? I mean, thrillers rise and fall on the villain more than they do on the hero. So at that point, Barnes & Noble was in that position. And there was I think it was the Northern California Booksellers Association. It was a California Bookseller Association. I'm pretty sure it was the Northern one, but I could be wrong. But anyway, they brought a lawsuit against Barnes & Noble claiming unfair trade practice. And the reason was that if you are running a warehouse operation, if you have any sense, what you do is your biggest orders are on the dock and they go out first, right? So if somebody's ordered 1,000 books and then 500 books and then 200 books, the big guys go out. And then they ship the small orders. Well, most independent bookstores, of which there were many, many more then than there are today. When I started the Poison Pen, and it's a mystery bookstore just because I thought, having been a lawyer, that you needed a specialty. It's really hard to be a general lawyer. It's hard to be a general bookseller unless you bought, some enormous property. And I like mystery best, so that's what it was. And there were 30 mystery bookstores. And we had a whole association and the whole bit. Now there are like 4 of us, and we're not even a mystery bookstore anymore. We've moved way past that, but nonetheless. So they brought the lawsuit claiming that the Independent Bookseller Association in Northern California, that Barnes & Noble had an advantage because they would get their books, the new books, like the new John Grisham, really hot books, on Friday. And they had the whole weekend to sell them. And then the little orders wouldn't show up till the next week. And they said it wasn't fair. And, they sued and they won the lawsuit against the major publishers. So the question was, what were the major publishers going to do about this? Because now they've lost. So their decision was that they would move the on-sale date to Tuesday, and that way all the books could get where they were supposed to go on Monday. But that was before there was any shipping tracking and all. Now, if you order anything today, I got a notice the other day that my product, whatever it is, has reached the port of Shanghai. Okay, where's it coming from here? So today, with shipping the way it is, you don't need to have Tuesday the on-sale day, because shipping's too sophisticated now. And actually, shipping is such a disaster now, I should say. Tracking it is easy, but, you can get your books now any day of the week. It hardly matters. So the Tuesday thing is just totally artificial, and it really makes no sense. And and it hurts authors because the best-selling reporting system runs from Sunday morning through Saturday night. So when you've made the on sale day Tuesday, you have cut 2 days out of the on sale week for every new author. So they don't get their Sunday. There are no Sunday and Monday sales, right? If the on sale day is Tuesday. So instead of having a whole 7 days to collect data for the sale of the book, you wind up with 5 days. So we have resisted that, and I shouldn't say too much about it before somebody lands on me, but you will have noticed that most of our big events are on Monday or sometimes on Saturday or Sunday. And I think there needs to be a general agreement among publishers to set the on sale date for Monday. Because it's really not fair to authors the way that it works, and it's not necessary anymore. But the technology just didn't exist back then. You know, people are, I mean, you have to be as old as I am and in this business as long to even remember, because people ask me all the time, you know, publishers ask me, why is the on sale day Tuesday? And I'm going, okay, you're just, you know, you just didn't live through it, so you don't remember it. The other thing I thought was really interesting is that I chaired a bookseller roundtable about that same time at a meeting of the American Bookseller Association in California. And I was asked to chair a roundtable, and I can't remember what the general subject matter was. But this whole thing came up again because the lawsuit was going on. And the room was full of booksellers complaining that Barnes & Noble had this unfair advantage and they couldn't sell the new John Grisham. And I really got fed up with that. And I mean, I'm realistic. And I finally said to them, you know, you're doing this all wrong. I said, you're never going to sell a lot of John Grisham because you can't afford the 30% discount that, you know, Barnes & Noble is going to apply to it. I said, you shouldn't even be thinking about trying to sell bestsellers. What you should be thinking about is finding new authors. And that was when Nevada Bar had published Track of the Cat. And I said, for example, you could sell 100 or 200, we just did, copies of Track of the Cat instead of John Grisham for the same amount of money. So why do you care about John Grisham? And their answer absolutely rocked me. And I developed an entire business plan from this answer. Their answer was, but we would have to read Nevada Bar to sell Nevada Bar. We don't have to read John Grisham to sell it. And I thought, right then, okay, and I came back and I hired another person or two, and my job became reading the books that we sell. Wow. You can tell that I have read your book, right? That's my job. And honestly, I almost never recovered from that.
I can understand that.
So, it's just, you know, there's a lot that goes into a long history of doing something in any industry, and you have to figure out how to move forward and adapt to it all. Is that it?
We've got a couple other questions.
Okay. I probably have some publishers saying, Barbara.
So one question is, who's Joey Hartstone's publisher? And the second one is, how long did you spend researching and being in a small Texas town to get this deal?
The publisher is Doubleday, who also publishes John Grisham, so stop saying bad things about him.
Sorry.
Just kidding.
Actually, Doubleday is part of Penguin Random House, which is the largest publisher, and it's one of the imprints of Penguin Random House.
Yeah. And then, yeah, I probably had this idea for about 3 or 4 years. And like I said, I spent 2 years trying to think how I would conceive it as a TV show. And then basically 3 things happened at once. I didn't get the job on The Lincoln Lawyer. Every writer in Hollywood had to fire our agent for some arbitration that is too boring to get into here. And then the pandemic hit. And so I found myself with nothing to write. And I had this one idea. I had just been inspired by The Lincoln Lawyer. And so, yeah, I had traveled to Marshall, and I'd already done a lot of research, fortunately, because I wasn't able to go there at that time.
How long were you there?
I was only there for about a week, but I met with a lot of lawyers there who I stayed in contact with, and it was really helpful just going around the town. I wanted to do more research, but I think writers always want to do more research because it's often easier than writing. But the pandemic was a good enough excuse, and my wife and I had just had a baby, and so I knew I wasn't going to get back there for a couple of years, and I thought, all right, well, let me write it, and then when I felt like I couldn't quite capture what Marshall was, or I didn't know the answer, I just sort of wrote a little bit of Flagstaff in there too, and I figured that would feel authentic to everyone who wasn't a Marshall resident, because it was true. It just wasn't necessarily true about Marshall.
So, did your credentials as a TV writer and a successful one make it easier for you to find an agent and get published, do you think?
Yes, I think so. I also, my agent is a good friend of mine who went to college with my wife, so I think that made it very easy. But yeah, I think that my wife has a joke about the smoke and mirrors of it all, but she says, I'm going to sell a book because I have a TV career, and then I'm going to get to adapt the book into a television show because there's a book, and no one's going to have read either of them, but it won't matter. I
think that's a pretty good summation, actually, counsel.
Yeah.
It is. No, it's funny how it all works. But the hardest part of getting published today is actually to find an agent, somebody who will represent you. And the major publishers, with rare exceptions, don't take on an unagented author. There used to be that whole bit about, manuscripts would come in over the transom, and there was some person that, in the basement that read, no, seriously, that read them, and that phrase, it got plucked from the slush pile was actually true, but it doesn't work that way really anymore. Yeah. So the advantage that you had of already,
I think so.
Makes a big difference. Yeah. And if you have a good agent, then the odds are that you will get a good publisher, so it's a combination of luck and hard work, isn't it? Yeah.
And so I think the transition, once you've established yourself as a professional writer, it makes it easier to transition to another professional writing job, I think.
It will be hilarious if you end up making a TV series out of all of this. So this is the reason it's always good to come to meet a first author, because you'll never have a chance again to hear these kinds of stories. So is there anything you'd like to say before we sign off?
This is only the second event I've done, so it's so nice to meet actual people and to get to travel and to get to see bookstores like this. So thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's really a pleasure. Most bookstores will not actually interview you. You will be on your own.
Yeah. I'm sure. Well, this was much more fun, so thank you for that too.
Well, my pleasure. I really loved the book. I was very, very happy to. I have to say, I was momentarily put off by the cover, and only in the sense I couldn't figure out what in the world a book with a truck on the cover was going to be about. So, but I plunged in. Yeah. And then I think I read for voice. I read less for what the book is about, but I read mostly, especially a debut, with how much the author's voice appeals to me. And it's like going to a party or something. You meet some people and you think, you don't want to see them again. And so not every author will resonate with every reader, because we all bring our own baggage to reading the book, right? So I used to wonder why anyone would care what I thought. I'm serious. When I first started this, and I thought, my husband said to me, with all these people streaming by, you have to write to them, because none of them lived here. That's how we became such a international bookstore, as we wrote to people back in the days when we did a printed newsletter with an order form and people sent checks, and we had a fax machine for the people from Japan. And we were over there in the Arts District where people were always walking around. So we never had a marketing plan or a business plan. We don't do any advertising, we just sort of open the door. But I still remember thinking, well, write a newsletter. Why will anyone care what I think? But then I discovered that, people do actually want somebody to read a book and discuss it. Whether they agree with you or not doesn't really matter. So
I had the same thought when I wrote this. Why would anyone care what I think? So
well, yeah. I mean, it's not that being a reviewer is actually not that different in that dynamic. So, and then of course I've moved on to being an editor and other stuff, and it's been a lot of fun. But thank you, Joy.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all for watching it this afternoon and for being here this afternoon. Would you like to get? Oh, wait! I promised that we would give books away at every event, and I have 2 of them up in the front. So I'm going to detach myself from my microphone and go get them.
Okay.
Are we done?
Yeah, we don't need to end the video.
Yes. So once again, if you're not here, you can't get a free book. And actually, I have 2 this afternoon, so this is an incentive for attending. All right. So